And happy Saturday afternoon. We want to welcome all of you to another Grace Live conversation. This week, we have a special guest, and I really just want to jump into it because we got a topic this week that could really probably take 2 to 3 hours, if not 2 to 3 days to discuss, and we have 30 minutes. So, but it's an important topic, and it's a topic that I think so many people are struggling with or have struggled with. And it's one that needs to be talked about. When we have these issues, especially inside the church, one way to begin addressing them, and even for those who've been hurt, to begin the road of healing is to begin talking about it. And so my name is Boz Tchidjian. I'm the executive director of Grace. And this week for our Grace Live conversations, we have Scot McKnight joining us to talk about toxic cultures within the church. Scott is a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary up in Illinois. He's the author of, I think, from what it says, Scott, over 80 books. I don't even understand and grasp that. That's quite amazing. I'm not sure if I've even read 80 books in my life, let alone written them. But anyway, Scott is somebody that I have come to know and respect in so many ways, but especially on this issue that we're going to be talking about today. And so, Scott, I just want to welcome you to this event and thank you for taking the time to speak with us about such an important topic.
Well, Boz, I've known you from your work in this topic on grace, and I want to say thanks for the invitation to be with you and to talk. I know my daughter would be involved as well. She'll be watching, and she helped me very much in the writing of this book. So, but 30 minutes is right. It can take a long time.
Well, we'll get as much as we can into it, and probably my guess is we might be having you back sometime soon to keep this discussion going. Now, just recently, you had a book. In fact, it just came out within the last week or two, correct?
Yes.
And it's a book called A Church Called Tov. I'm holding it up here. It's probably backwards on your screen. I can't remember if that would be backwards or not, but the subtitle of the book is Forming a Goodness Culture that Resists Abuses of Power and Promotes Healing. There's a lot to that title, Scott. And I guess my first question is, why write this book? I mean, you're a professor of New Testament at a seminary. What prompted a professor of New Testament at a seminary to write about toxic churches and how to form a goodness culture?
Well, the short answer to that question is my daughter, Laura Berenger, was deeply involved at the time at Willow Creek. And when the Bill Hybels story news broke, she and her husband, Mark, had all kinds of questions for me. Mm. And we just began to talk. And eventually I wrote up a couple pages, turned it into a blog post in June, like 3 months after the news story broke, and realized that there was something to say. I thought I had something to say about goodness, and eventually it unfolded. But I have to be perfectly honest, I couldn't have written this without her, and I wouldn't have written it without her persistence. So Laura kept me going on this, and then I would feed her ideas, write stuff up. She would write stuff up, and we began to work together. Eventually, it turned into a book.
Well, what an honor for you to be able to work with one of your children on such a fundamentally important topic.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. And our next conversation on this, I vote that Laura joins us.
Okay.
Well, let's start off with just a basic. Let's think about the terms we're going to use in this conversation. And when we talk about the term toxic culture, how would you define that term for those listening?
A toxic church culture is a church in which a culture forms that is detrimental to people growing in Christ, to living the Christian life. It is usually captured by a male leader who is, and a group of, I call them retainers around him, who are sustaining, retaining, promoting this person who is feeding a toxic culture. And many times it's not on display in church. I mean, toxic church culture leaders are masters of persona and image, and they manage it very, very well. But we found over and over that toxic cultures are recognizable, but they're often in pockets of power in the church rather than the whole church. I mean, there are churches that are altogether bad, but there aren't very many of them. So I think it's a church culture that does not permit true Christian freedom and growth in the Christian life, so that people become more Christ-like. That's when it's becoming toxic.
I think what you mentioned a minute ago, I think is true. I think for the person who might show up on Sunday morning and stay at church for an hour and then go home, not to return until the following Sunday, they may not see or experience much of that. It's my experience has been, it's those who begin to step forward and getting more involved in the life and community of the church that begin to experience it, begin to maybe see little bits of it. A lot of times I've encountered so many people who, when they begin to see bits of abusive of power or any type of toxicity in the leadership, they're always second guessing themselves and always going, no, maybe it's me. There's no way that there's no way what I'm seeing or experiencing is how I'm interpreting it. Must be something different. And again, so much of it is sort of a guilt on themselves, or even having the thought that the behavior that they're experiencing or maybe witnessing is somehow wrong or hurtful. How would you, does that sound consistent? And why is it that we immediately, so many of us in the church, when we see these types of behaviors, or maybe, experience some of them, immediately take a step back and second guess it, and maybe even blame ourselves for having those thoughts?
Well, Boz, you're a master of this topic with all the investigations and research your organization has done. And I totally agree with what you, and I've learned from you on this very topic. But our experience is that ordinary people trust pastors and leaders in churches. Furthermore, ordinary people think pastors speak for God. They believe that they are spiritually superior. Now, they may not use the word superior, but they expect them to be spiritual and Christian life guides. So they immediately impute. Now, this is people who haven't had bad experiences who now become cynical, but ordinary people impute and infer and assume that a pastor is someone who can be trusted, as honest, as good, do the right thing, all these things. And so when they begin to have questions, they have to think that it's their fault, because it can't be the pastor's fault. Mm-hmm. And that dynamic right there is the dynamic that toxic pastors trade in. Mm-hmm. They know that people will trust them, so they take advantage of the trust. And as long as they can get by with it, the church seems to be flowing along perfectly.
And it's not only they know that people will trust them. What I have found is that they also know that dynamic, that the person will second guess themselves.
Yeah.
And they will exploit that, so that the person is doing that even more so. And the goal of that, or one of the goals of that, is to keep that person silent.
Yes.
And so,
well, you know all about the power culture that develops in some of these churches. Yeah. And pastors who are toxic, who are narcissistic, will use their power, and they will use fear. And they create a culture around them where people realize when they disagree. I just heard a story the other day. A woman raised a question with a pastor. This is only staff. Raised a question. And it was a good question, because it had to do with the culture of that church that was seemingly neglected by this new pastor. This pastor writes this young woman a letter and says, don't ever disagree with me again in public.
Mm.
Now, that woman is afraid.
Mhm.
She's afraid probably to talk to other people in the church because they now know they'll get pounced on. So using fear and threatening people, and then using affirmation that if you're in the inside circle, then you are especially approved. And I have met countless people, well, count hundreds of people over the years who, because they were insiders with famous pastors, celebrity pastors, that they really had a raise of their own ego and they thought they were something special. Well, the pastor trades in that too, Boz. He thinks, well, I've got them now in my circle. I've got them wanting my approval. Now, if I suggest I won't approve something, they won't do that. And it creates this entire fear culture. And in that culture, people start doing whatever the pastor wants. And I think you're exactly right. When they begin to think that they're seeing something wrong, they immediately think it's their fault. They think, well, I must not be perceiving this. And then I learned from you. I was working on a project on German pastors after World War II, and I began to map how pastors processed the Holocaust. And they did not take responsibility for anything Hitler did. And you think, really? Really? And they were blaming other countries, the United Kingdom or England, the United States for invading them, the Soviet Union, instead of taking responsibility for not speaking up when they had their opportunities. They started blaming, and they confuse the lay people, and the pastors even themselves got confused because of the power mongering. And then these power people, you develop some of the categories that churches use when they are trying to intimidate and silence people. And we develop that, some of what you said, and what I learned from the German pastors, and then other things, into false narratives that churches use, all as an attempt to create an alternative narrative, one that they want to be told, and to silence their critics.
Yeah, we find, sadly, have found that oftentimes in the work that we've done, and that is somebody says something, comes forward, and what people don't realize is for somebody in most of these types of churches to even step forward comes after a lot of trepidation, a lot of anxiety, a lot of second guessing, but they'll step forward, and the response they get automatically triggers what I would call this false narrative spinning, where the leadership of that type of church begins spinning a narrative, has very little to do with the substance of the issue that the person came forward with, and they create a new narrative, also oftentimes putting that particular person at the center of the narrative as being somebody who is a problem, or somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, or somebody who's heretical. And pretty soon the church is now convincing the congregation and the membership that the leadership are the victims.
Yes.
And that the victim is actually the perpetrator.
That's
and
right.
So it completely turns everything upside down. And so now, of course, you've got the general membership who is has over time, through these type of toxic cultures, have embraced this type of leadership without question, oftentimes,
That's
or
right.
fear of providing any questions. And they're seeing this particular person as an attacker of the church, and that the church leaders are those who've been victimized by this individual. And so pretty soon, this person who has stood up and stepped forward is now either marginalized or more often vilified. And that takes us to that issue of, which I think is huge in this topic, and that is the issue of community, of fear of losing community. You talk a lot about various types of fears that seem to be at the heart of these types of abusive faith environments. And, I have found, and again, in the work we've done, a fear of losing community is oftentimes at the very center of why people say something or why they don't. Because for many of us, church life is community. For most for many people, especially in the evangelical world, whether this is right or wrong or healthy or not, most of their community is found inside the church that they are part of. And so the thought of losing that community, the thought of losing those relationships, losing those friendships is profound. And the fear of that drives them to either not say anything, or when they do say something, they find themselves on the outside. And what is most troubling to me is I can tell you time and time again of parents of children who were sexually victimized by somebody inside the church who did step forward and make that known to leadership, who not weeks later now find themselves on the outside of community, now find themselves at Walmart seeing a member that they knew as a friend for many, many years, and they catch their eyes and that member turns around and walks the other way. And they're going, wait a minute, it was my child whose life has been decimated by somebody connected to this church. And what's the result? We've lost our community. And so I've talked to parents who are fearful of even bringing that issue up to church leadership because of that fear, though most, to their credit, have said, you know what, if advocating for my child and speaking truth about what happened to my child prompts me to lose this community, it's worth the risk because I want to be the greatest advocate of my little one that there is. And many of them walk away from the church, and I don't blame them. But what other fears do you have you seen as it relates to these types of communities and how they exploit them?
In the last week, I've gotten 3 letters telling me that very story right there.
Wow.
Is that they lost community. Another fear, and I found this to be characteristic of some of the people that we talked to. People were afraid, number one, that they would hurt the church and that the ministry, and look, the churches that we have investigated the most, Willow Creek, Harvest Chapel, some of the Southern Baptist churches, a little bit of Sovereign Grace. You know, these are often really good churches, or at least they do a lot of really good things. And they don't want to be the part that hurts that church. And they've heard stories of this. So there's a fear that if I bring this forward, I'm going to hurt things. I'm going to hurt the church. There's also a fear that they will hurt that pastor that they've come to admire and put up on a pedestal. I think there's a lot of fear of that, is that I heard a woman say, I didn't want to be the one who brought down Bill Hybels because of all the great things that have been accomplished through this church. And I know a man who was on staff at another church who said, I knew things. I would like to have said things. I should have said things. I didn't say things. It's too late now, but I admired what this pastor was doing so much that I just simply couldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
So that, but I think what you gave, that's the very heart of the issue, is that these people lose community. I talked to 2 people the other day, or a person wrote me a letter and said they lost every friend in that church. And that was their only friends for 20 years. They had given their life to that church, and now they have none of the people in that church. My daughter experienced this at Willow Creek. She'd go back and she'd see people who knew her, who had been close friends, and because she had spoken up in comments on a Facebook page, they now saw her as the enemy. And this is one of the things I noticed. And Boz, I don't know how often you see this, is demonizing these people. And what I mean is it goes from being a critic of the church to you are in allegiance or in alliance with Satan. This is demonic. And man, when you ramp it up to the level of being satanic, most people who have any sense of reverence are going to back down and begin to ask, wow, maybe I'm the one who's wrong. And now they've won. But the other side that I totally agree with you on is, and I don't know the psychology of this, but these perpetrators of sexual violence and power violence somehow have a trick of being able to turn themselves into victims and make
Yeah.
the people who are making allegations the ones who are the perpetrators.
Yeah.
And it's a sickening brilliance
Yeah.
of turning the table the wrong way.
And we in the work of grace, we've seen a lot of that type of fear instilled even in children. I recall an investigation we did of a missionary organization, and these kids at a boarding school, young kids who were being sexually victimized and physically abused by the boarding school teachers and leaders who were other missionaries. And these kids' parents could be thousands of miles away. And when we had more than one story where a child stepped forward to want to say something to some leader at the school about what they were experiencing. And the leader at the school said, you really need to think twice about whether you tell your parents this.
Yeah.
Because if you tell them that, it's going to require them to come here. And if they come here, there'll be Africans who will be in hell because of that, because they won't have the opportunity to hear the gospel. What that does to a 7 or 8 or 12-year-old child is indescribable.
Yeah.
And so what happened? Most of them kept quiet, because the worst thing they could think of would be that they would be responsible personally for sending people to hell.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, ultimate fear of losing community and ultimately fear of losing salvation for these, if I say something or bring out this truth to light. Well, let me ask you this. We're already only have 8 more minutes left. So I think we are going to have to continue this conversation, but I do want to spend the last few minutes talking about some hope, because, the subtitle of your book is Forming a Goodness Culture. And so we've sort of described in general, what a toxic culture looks like. Again, we could spend a lot more time talking about that. But, when we think about a goodness culture, can you think of some things that individuals can do, but also communities can do to help in forming a goodness culture within their own faith community?
Yeah. One of the things that I've realized through my wife, Chris, who's a psychologist, is that if a toxic church almost always has a narcissist pastor, narcissists don't change. The idea that I'm gonna go talk to the pastor, he's gonna see the light and gonna change is okay. You can try it, but our experience with that is the chances are close to zero. All right, so and there is a tendency to want to say, I want my whole church to change. I think that has to be recognized that's a big picture item, and that church cultures don't form overnight and they don't reform overnight. So I plead with people to form around themselves pockets of tov, pockets of goodness. Get in a small group of people who are tov, undeterred by what's going on around you, not spending your time complaining, but becoming people who are empathetic to other people. So if a woman comes forward with an allegation, you're the group that wants to talk to her and listen to her and believe her, that you want to show grace to people. We have to tell stories. You have to tell stories, Boz, in your ministry. The goal is not expose and criticism. The goal is ultimately for people to experience grace. And I love the title of your group, Grace, is we want people to experience grace and to be transformed by it. But you don't really know grace until you've known the problem that requires the need of grace. Yeah. We think of a pocket. Laura and I believe that a pocket of tov puts people first. They know people's names. They know their stories. They know who's wounded and who's hurting. And they want those people to be treated as people. I've often noticed that in these toxic churches, people are dispensable. When you know a person's name and their story and you've come to love them, they're no longer dispensable. If they are, then you've got the problem, not them. We also believe that we need a routine development of learning to tell the truth. I call this a Yom Kippur tradition. God taught Israel, every year you're going to come here and you're going to confess your sins. And don't tell me you didn't have any, because we're going to do this every year. And we want you to afflict ourselves. We have Lent in the church, but sometimes it's just giving up chocolate or, Facebook. Instead, I think we need a routine confession of sins in churches to recognize that this is a part of who we are. I think we have to practice doing the right thing in these pockets so that when we see something, we're willing to speak to it, to the situation. So many people I've talked to in some of these churches have said, I saw the pastor do that and I should have said something. And they didn't do the right thing. We also want to develop, instead of heroizing people, we want to develop a culture in a pocket of Tov of where we're serving other people. Now, here's what I believe. If we practice empathy and grace and putting people first and telling the truth and doing the right thing and serving others, we become Christ-like and we become a witness in this pocket of Tov of the way things ought to be. And all of us have been with people like this, people who are Tov, and they rub off on us. We want to be Tov around them. And we've been around churches or small groups that are filled with Tov people, and we want to be like, that's what I think we can do. That's my hope, is that we will study, of course, I want people to read the book and to think about these topics, but to get into circles, pockets of Tov, where we can begin to practice things that would be the alternative to toxic church cultures.
So here's the cynic coming out of me. So I'll just be honest. I'll say, okay, somebody forms a pocket of Tov in their church, in their toxic church, and very shortly thereafter, they're getting a call from a pastor or somebody on staff because they don't really like this pocket. And suddenly now the pocket of Tov becomes sort of like that individual who stepped forward, and that is, you all need to get back in line. And I guess one thought, but this is I think the hopeful part of that is, I think as I'm hearing you, a pocket of Tov could also be people that and relationships that you have, especially other believers who are maybe not part of your individual church.
Yeah.
So you've been able to pull aside a little bit. Now, pastors don't like that either, but you're having those conversations, and you have that mini community, and we've done that. I mean, Zane and I have been a part of I would call maybe a pocket of Tov, where and some other friends of ours have been a part of it, where we have come together as those who love Jesus, but have all experienced those types of toxic environments within churches. Sometimes we are maybe even still attending one, but we've been able to pull aside, and man, it's like breathing oxygen. In many ways, I've walked away going, you know what, God, this is the way you work, because it always surprises me, but this is my church. This has been much more of my church to me, because it is that pocket of Tov than the place in many ways I'm fleeing from, and that I had to create this pocket of Tov because of what I've been experiencing over here. But I still feel a little bit too uneasy or guilty walking away from that type of environment. Let me ask this in closing, because I think we're about out of time, but I want to ask you this, Scott. What would you say to somebody? How would you share with somebody who's listening today, who's given up on being part of a local church because of how they have been repeatedly wounded, mostly by leadership, but also by others within the church who have followed in line with leadership's responses to whatever issues that they have experienced? What do we tell somebody like that who's given up, who maybe actually who has appreciated the COVID time in the sense that it's given them the opportunity to do online church and maybe to check out other places, but now they're getting calls, hey, you coming back? And when are you going to be here? And they're really uneasy about taking that step back into that type of environment. Do you have any words of encouragement or direction for those? Because I think there are quite a few of them out there.
Laura, I think, came up with the expression in our book, wounded resistors. And that's who we're talking about, wounded resistors. And I would say to them, I understand why you don't want to be involved in the church. And I understand why, if you do get involved, you're going to hold back because you don't trust the powers and what you see on the platform may not be reality. Okay, so I'd say that. But I would want to focus on this. I would say, I want you to return to the Gospels and read stories about Jesus, because there you're going to find the man of Tov.
Yeah.
In the book of Tov. And so I would say, return to Jesus and get your vision there. Let him minister to you. Don't think that all your spiritual ministry is going to come through the pastor. Let Jesus, through the power of the Spirit, take you to the next level and listen to where he's leading you to go. I would tell people, there's hope on the other side, but you don't have to hope in that church.
Yeah.
You have to put your hope in Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That it ultimately comes back to Jesus. You're right. Yeah. The embodiment of Tov.
Yeah.
And something that I think too many of our churches have lost sight of.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for this time together. There's a lot more to talk about on this, and
Yes.
I'm going to try to convince everybody to do this again, and convince you and Laura to join us in the future to maybe dive a little bit deeper in some of these subtopics that we've just begun to scratch the surface on. But thank you for your voice. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your boldness. I remember in the middle of the Willow Creek matter, you stepped forward your voice was so incredibly important to so many people, because they were looking for somebody who would speak about it. And so many people initially were silent, and you weren't. And I just am grateful for that. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Boz. And Laura and I really have learned a lot from you. And we're grateful for all that you've done to help so many of these wounded resistors hear the grace of God. So, and defend them and justice and do the right thing. So I want to thank you.
One of the greatest privileges of my life has been to encounter and know such people. So I often tell people the people I've met in this work have been a more beautiful reflection of Jesus to me than most of the people I have ever met in churches.
Oh, wow.
And I'm grateful to God for that. That's a good, it's a hopeful.
That's good. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. We will revisit this and to dive in, and maybe through some of your comments, maybe select some topics that are under the umbrella of this issue that many of you may be struggling with. But we also want to ask you join us for the next Grace Live conversation, which will be on November 14th. So middle of November. And we're going to be focusing on what goes on in Grace investigations. As you know, Grace does many independent investigations, and we're going to talk about those. We're going to have some of the actual investigators who lead these investigations join in a conversation, so you have a little bit more awareness of what an investigation is, what happens during an investigation, and what are some of the results, and hopefully and prayerfully positive results that come out of a number of these investigations. So please join us again on November 14th, probably the same time, I think. We'll let you know as we send out the notices. But thank you again for joining us this afternoon. And Scott, again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Boz.